Penguin Random House Audio presents The New Silk Roads, The Present and Future of the World, by Peter Frankopan. Read for you by Leighton, Pugh.
Introduction. When The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, was published in 2015, it touched a nerve. As an author, naturally, I hoped that people would read and enjoy what I had written. As an academic historian, though, I had long found out that things I wanted to work on frequently had limited appeal to others. Conversations about my research at drinks parties and dinners did not often last for long, and even with my colleagues, engagement was usually directly linked to periods or regions of mutual interest. The success of the Silk Roads, therefore, took me by surprise. It turned out lots of people did want to learn more about the world, just as I had done when I was young. I was not the only one, after all, who wanted to learn about other peoples, cultures and regions that had enjoyed glorious times in the past that had been washed away by the insistent story of more recent histories. It quickly became apparent that moving the centre of focus away from the familiar story of Europe and the West to Asia and the East came as a breath of fresh air for many readers. So too did looking at the role of the connections that have linked continents together for millennia. In the late 19th century, the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen came up with a term to describe the networks of exchange linking Han Dynasty China with the world beyond. He called these connections die Seidenstraßen, or the Silk Roads, a term that caught the imagination of scholars and the general public alike. Richthofen's concept of the Silk Roads was vague in terms of identifying a precise geographic scope of how goods, ideas and people moved between Asia and Europe and Africa, and explaining quite how the Pacific Ocean and South China Sea were connected with the Mediterranean and ultimately the Atlantic. In fact, the looseness of what is meant by the Silk Roads can also be helpful, not least because they were not roads in the modern meaning of the word, or because they obscure the difference between long and short distance trade, or even because many other goods and commodities besides silk were also traded, and in some cases in greater volume than expensive textiles. In fact, the Silk Roads serves as a term that describes the way in which people, cultures and continents were woven together, and in doing so helps us better understand the way that religions and languages spread in the past, while showing how ideas about food, fashion and art disseminated, competed and borrowed from each other. The Silk Roads help make clear the centrality of the control of resources and of long-distance trade, and therefore explain the contexts and motivations for expeditions across deserts and oceans that helped fashion the rise of empires. The Silk Roads show how technological innovation was stimulated across thousands of miles, and how violence and disease often followed the same patterns of destruction. The Silk Roads allow us to understand the past not as a series of periods and regions that are isolated and distinct, but to see the rhythms of history in which the world has been connected for millennia as being part of a bigger, inclusive global past. If I had written The Silk Roads 25 years ago, it would have been equally topical. In the early 1990s, the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed, prompting major upheaval not only in Russia, but in all the 15 constituent republics that subsequently became independent. The early 1990s, too, marked the first Gulf War that was so closely linked to the subsequent intervention in Iraq at the start of the 21st century. It was a time of profound change in China, where a series of reforms was about to propel the country's emergence not as a regional, but a global superpower. Winds of change were also blowing in Turkey, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and across the Middle East then, because that is what always happens along the Silk Roads, the networks that are the world's central nervous system. A few weeks after my book was published in the summer of 2015, I had lunch with a friend in London who was one of the first to read it. "I found it strangely comforting," he said. "It made me realize that change is normal, that big shifts in the global center of power are quite common, and that this chaotic and unfamiliar world is perhaps not so strange and unusual after all." Even in the few short years since The Silk Roads was published, much has changed. From my perspective as a historian, there have been a series of advances in how we can understand the past that are immensely exciting. Scholars working in different fields, on different periods and regions, have produced work that is as innovative as it is compelling. Archaeologists using satellite imagery and spatial analysis have identified irrigation systems made up of cisterns, canals and dams dating to the 4th century AD that explain how crops were grown in inhospitable conditions in northwestern China at a time when exchanges with the world beyond were beginning to rise. Data from commercial and spy satellites, as well as from drones used in military surveillance in Afghanistan, has been tapped into by researchers working as part of the Afghan Heritage Mapping Partnership. This has resulted in the building up of a detailed picture of an infrastructure of caravanserais, water channels and residential complexes that once housed travellers in the centre of Asia, which helps transform how we understand the way in which the Silk Roads of the past were connected. The fact that much of this work has been done remotely also shows how the way in which research is done in the early 21st century is itself evolving. Advances in scientific methodology have also shed new light on the relationship between nomads and those living in cities in the pre-modern era in the heart of Asia. Analysis of carbon and nitrogen isotopes on 74 human remains from 14 burial grounds in Central Asia help reveal the distinct dietary habits of those who lived in settled as opposed to nomadic communities, while also suggesting that nomads enjoyed a wider variety of foodstuffs than those who lived in villages, towns and cities. This in turn raises important questions about the role played by mobile populations in introducing new trends and spreading cultural change across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. Genetic and ethno-linguistic evidence has meanwhile been used to show how the spread of walnut forests and the evolution of language overlapped across large parts of Asia. Fossilized remnants of desiccated walnut seeds suggest that walnut trees were deliberately planted as long-term agricultural investments by traders and those travelling along the Silk Roads, in turn opening up ways better to understand the relationship between the natural world and the impact of rising levels of exchange locally, regionally, and beyond. As well as everything else, the Silk Roads acted as gene corridors for humans and for flora and fauna alike. Then there is new research that links the origins of Yiddish with commercial exchange across Asia and claims that its evolution was connected to measures designed to protect the security of transactions by devising a language that could only be understood by a select few. This has obvious resonance in the world of the 21st century, where cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology seek to solve the problem of how to enable traders to complete transactions securely. Or there is the startling evidence from new generation ice core technology that can be used to shed fresh light on the devastating impact of the Black Death by showing the extent of the collapse in metal production in the mid-14th century. Documents declassified in 2017, recording meetings held between the British minister in Washington in 1952, Sir Christopher Steele, and the Assistant Secretary of State Henry Byroad to discuss a coup to depose the Prime Minister of Iran, help us gain a clearer understanding of how the ill-fated plans took shape. The release of previously secret US nuclear strike plans from the early part of the Cold War likewise helped reveal important insights into American military and strategic planning, and contemporary assessments of how best to neutralize the Soviet Union in the event of war. These are just a small number of examples to show how historians continue to use different techniques to refine and improve their understanding of the past. This is what makes history such an invigorating and exciting subject. There is a thrill.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?